Hello and good evening. Welcome to this seminar on the arrest and detention of the trial of Dr. Muhammad al-Khudari. This event has been brought to you by Arab Organization for Human Rights. I am Naseem Ahmed. I'm a writer and an analyst, political analyst for the Middle East Monitor. It's delighted to be here and to have this guest with us to discuss the situation of Dr. Muhammad al-Khudari, the 81-year-old Palestinian. Him, along with his son, Dr. Hani al-Khudari, were arbitrarily arrested and they remain in detention without charge. The detention and incarceration, as we know, is part of a much broader crackdown on human rights, on activists in Saudi Arabia. Just this summer, Saudi authorities detained approximately 60 Palestinians, including students, academics, and businessmen. With regards to Dr. al-Khudari, he recently was brought to the notorious specialized criminal court. This is the Saudi counter-terror court, which passes judgments on any kind of vague, ill-defined charges. To add to his plight, Dr. Khudari, he suffers from prostate cancer. He's been recovering from surgery when he was arrested. And since his arrest, he has been denied adequate medical care. And the conditions in which he is being held are damaging and really damaging to his health. To discuss his situation and, of course, the broader crackdown on human rights activists, we are joined by a number of speakers. I'd like to begin with Heidi Testel. She is a barrister practicing international criminal law. She is a counsel for Dr. Muhammad al-Khudari. She'll be presenting, she's been representing Khudari at the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and has submitted papers on their detention. So I think her presentation will bring us up to speed, give us the updates and background on the situation, and then we'll proceed with other guests. And later on, we may have a discussion. If anyone wants to jump in, please do raise your hand and jump in, ask questions, and I may also ask our guests a number of questions. So Heidi, over to you.
Thanks very much. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to all the organizers who put together this discussion in order to spotlight the violations which both Dr. Muhammad al-Khudari and also his son, Dr. Hani al-Khudari, have been subjected to for over 2.5 years while they've been detained together in Saudi Arabia. So as Naseem said, I joined this conversation today as counsel for Dr. Muhammad and Dr. Hani al-Khudari in regards to the ongoing proceedings before the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. What I'd like to do today is highlight the reality of the al-Khudari's detention by discussing the proceedings before the working group, including the submissions on violations of their rights and the status of the proceedings. So before I address the al-Khudari's case, let me frame my comments about their case in the context of the working group. And I'll start first by reviewing the function of the working group on arbitrary detention and what it can consider and determine. The working group is a non-treaty-based mechanism which allows for consideration of individual complaints from anyone who alleges that their rights have been violated by detention which can be found to be of an arbitrary character. This applies for detention which occurs anywhere in the world. The purpose and function of the working group in regards to its complaint procedure is to make a determination about whether an individual's detention can be categorized as arbitrary and therefore that it's unlawful, and to make recommendations to the state where the individual is being detained based on those findings. The working group has said that detention is arbitrary in a number of scenarios. And some of those scenarios include the following. When there is no legal basis for the detention to begin with. So, for example, the person is arrested and detained with no charges or based on charges that don't exist. There's no law for the charges that they're arrested on. Also, the detention can be considered arbitrary when the basis for the person's arrest was that they were exercising fundamental human rights. So in that situation, it'd be the right to free speech or free assembly, for example, and they're arrested for exercising those rights. The working group can also find detention to be arbitrary if the person's right to a fair trial is violated with such gravity that it gives the detention an arbitrary character. Another scenario is when deprivation is for reasons of discrimination. So for the al-Khudaris, the communication to the working group submitted that their detention could be found to be arbitrary for 3 of those reasons. First, because their detention manifestly cannot be linked to any legal basis. Second, because their detention includes the total or partial non-observance of the right to a fair trial. And third, because their detention can be found to be for reasons of discrimination based on race and national origin as Palestinians in Saudi Arabia. In particular, that they were arrested along with over 60 other Palestinians who were living and working in Saudi Arabia and tried with them in a mass trial. To demonstrate that the al-Khudari's detention can be found to be arbitrary for all 3 of these reasons, the submission that I made on their behalf to the working group in December of 2019, one moment, I'm going to turn off the noise here so that, apologies on that. So the submission that I made in 2019 to the working group raised 3 groups of rights violations, including fair trial considerations, which is one of the scenarios that alone can make detention have an arbitrary character, violations to the right to health, and violations of torture. Each of these groups of violation draws on Saudi Arabia's human rights obligations. Although we speak about the fact that Saudi Arabia has refrained from joining many of the most basic human rights treaties, we must remember that it is still a party to the Convention Against Torture. It has ratified the Arab Charter on Human Rights, and as a member of the United Nations, it must respect the protections set out in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights as adopted by the General Assembly, as well as the UN Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, the Mandela Rules. Although these aren't expansive amounts of documents, these human rights documents provide for a number of protections for individuals, which Saudi Arabia is obligated to respect and ensure. For example, in regards to fair trial considerations, the working group was informed in the communication that was submitted to it that the following fair trial rights, all set out in the documents that I mentioned, have been violated during the course of the al-Khudari's arrest and detention. First of all, their right to be informed of the reasons for arrest and charges against them. They were arrested on the 4th of April 2019 without legal reason or charges, and were only presented charges on the first day of their trial in March 2020. So that's 11 months after they were arrested and detained without ever being brought before a judge or court during those 11 months to be able to challenge the reasons for their detention or to raise the fact that there had been no reasons given or any charges brought. It was also submitted in that communication that this alone is sufficient to demonstrate that their detention is arbitrary, but there are several other fair trial considerations and irregularities that draw a lot of concern and contribute to a finding that their detention is arbitrary. Both Dr. Mohammed and Dr. al-Khudari have been subjected to abusive and coercive interrogations during their detention. And this was particularly in the first months of their detention when they were held in solitary confinement. During that time, it was a 3-month period of solitary confinement and incommunicado detention. During that entire period, to remind you, they weren't aware of the charges against them or why they were being held. In addition, they were denied the ability to instruct and consult a local lawyer for the domestic proceedings against them. They were fully denied the ability to consult with a lawyer from their arrest until May 2020, which is over a year, and also importantly, 2 months after the trial began. So this means that they were unrepresented for the first 2 months of trial, despite requesting a lawyer. A lawyer was only appointed after significant efforts were made by the family, not the authorities, to find a lawyer who was willing to represent them, with others expressing fear of taking the case. And even then, when a local lawyer was appointed, that lawyer has never been allowed regular access to the al-Khudaris during the entire course of their detention, their trial proceedings, and what's going now into appeal proceedings. Last, in regards to fair trial rights, the right to communicate with family members has been consistently restricted and denied, particularly during those first 3 months when they were held in incommunicado detention. Now, not being able to communicate with their family impacts their fair trial rights because it denied the family the ability to know their situation and their location of detention for the purpose of seeking assignment of legal representation, to try to find a lawyer for them, or to raise other fair trial issues and help protect their rights. Now, you've also heard, it was mentioned in the introduction, that the health of Dr. Mohammed al-Khudari, who is detained now at the age of 83, I believe he was 81 when he was arrested and first detained, continues to significantly deteriorate. This is primarily due to the fact that he has prostate cancer, which hasn't been adequately treated with specialist care. His health has deteriorated to such a degree that he has lost the use of one arm, and he has also severe dental problems, which has resulted in teeth being lost and difficulty eating. And the difficulty in eating has been so substantial that he's lost a significant amount of weight. Now, the treatment he has been given by the Saudi authorities can be defined as reactionary at best. He's sent to the hospital when his well-being deteriorates to address his immediate well-being, but he is denied the specialist care and treatment for his underlying condition to help him get better. It should also be noted that Dr. Hani al-Khudari has also been denied adequate medical treatment, and particularly for some dental issues that he's had during the 2.5 years that he's also been detained. So this is in violation to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and also the Mandela Rules, which both set out that both Dr. Mohammed and Dr. Hani should receive the same care as any other civilian would. That's what the Mandela Rules specifically state, that it must be the same care as civilians who are outside the prison system, and that this must also include specialist care. So the last thing I want to raise is how Dr. Mohammed and Dr. Hani's continued detention has violated their fundamental rights against torture and cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. The treatment of the al-Khudaris for 3 months in solitary confinement clearly rose to the level of psychological torture. The situation of arrest without legal reason or explanation placed both in a position of extreme stress and in a situation where they were constantly fearing for their safety. The first 3 months of detention were entirely incommunicado, whereby they were prevented any chance to contact their family and to let them know of their whereabouts, only adding to the stress and emotional pressure. They were consistently interrogated for hours and in an abusive manner, and reported being in a state of constant, overwhelming pressure and emotional distress. And those abusive interrogations took place during a time period where they were unaware of the charges against them. They were not brought before a court. They had no lawyer to be able to advise them. And they, no doubt, were wondering whether what they were saying or what they were pressured to say during these abusive interrogations were going to be held during their trial against them and used as evidence against them. The psychological torture that they suffer also applies in regards to the lack of medical treatment. The failure to provide medical care and treatment only adds to the pain, suffering, and emotional stress, and thus contributes to the inhumane conditions of detention and aggravates the severity of the psychological torture. So those points summarize the grave violations to their rights while they've been detained in Saudi Arabia for over 2.5 years. While any one of these violations could be found to make their detention arbitrary, when viewed as a whole and considering the weight of all these violations that have compounded over 2.5 years, it's overwhelming. I'll finish by noting that the working group has now tabled this communication. The working group, often the procedure there can be quite slow and it can take a long time for cases to go before the working group and be considered for determination. And it was considered during the 91st session of the working group in September of this year. Now, even though it was considered in September, it takes some time for the working group to put together their determination. And at the moment, we are now waiting to hear the determination of the working group. And we hope for a positive outcome, because a positive outcome would allow for pressure on Saudi Arabia to not only ensure the rights of Dr. Mohammed and Dr. Hani, and to ensure that the harm that they've had, that they've suffered because of these violations is reversed. And we're hoping that there might also be a recommendation that they be released because of the unlawful and arbitrary nature of the detention. But it's also important because this will have implications for the 60 plus other individuals who were tried alongside them and who have also suffered very similar human rights violations and arbitrary detention as well. So I will end from my remarks with that and pass it back, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end or whenever you'd like me to. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. That was fantastic. I think you've summarized the situation for Dr. Hani really well and the arbitrary nature of his arrest. And thank you also for giving us really an explanation of how the process in the UN working group for arbitrary detention works. I think, of course, I have a number of questions about that, but before we get to the Q&A, I think you will stay with us for the rest of the show. Yeah, so I think I'll save the questions, and if anyone else wants to jump in, they can. So I'll leave the questions for now. I think we can move over to Raid. I think Raid Jarrar. Am I right, Raid? Can you? Are you okay to speak now? Are you okay to join?
Yes, I am, and thank you for inviting me.
So let me just say a bit about you, Raid. Raid is an Arab-American political analyst and an advocate. So over to you, Raid. Thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm very thankful for Aida for her comments. My name is Raid Jarrar. I am the Advocacy Director for Democracy for the Arab World Now with DAWN, which is the organization that was founded by the late Jamal Khashoggi. And DAWN focuses mainly on the U.S. engagement with the Arab world, and we keep a few governments in the Arab world on our radar on a daily basis, including the government of Saudi Arabia. So I want to say that the case that we're discussing today is not happening in a vacuum, that Saudi Arabia and the Saudi Arabian government is committing gross violations of human rights on a daily basis, including violations domestically, such as the case that we're discussing now, and violations in the region, like Saudi Arabia's war on Yemen, Saudi Arabia's indirect funding to other governments, like Sisi regime in Egypt, the Haftar groups in Libya, and now the ongoing coup in Tunisia that is being funded by Saudi Arabia and UAE. So it's what's going on is not just an individual case. It's not just an internal domestic matter. It's definitely an issue that the United States and Europe should keep an eye on, because of the very strong ties of the EU and the US with the government of Saudi Arabia. For us here in Washington, D.C., we have been advocating for a shift in policy between the United States and Saudi Arabia, rethinking this policy, and implementing US law that should prohibit US support or US military sales to abusive governments around the world. And Saudi Arabia just so happens to be one of the most abusive governments that the US is allied with.
Sorry to interject, Raed. Can you turn your camera on, please, if you don't mind? Is it okay for you to turn the camera on?
I'm having internet issues. I apologize.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Carry on.
I mean, the last point that I want to mention, and I know there are many other folks who are speaking this today. The last point that I want to mention is that one of the cases that Dawn has been following very closely is the case of our founder, Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered by agents of the Saudi government. And it has been years, but, just last week we marked the 3rd anniversary of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And 3 years after the murder, although we know as a fact that the highest levels of the Saudi government, including Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, were involved in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the United States government has refused to hold those behind the decision to kill Jamal Khashoggi accountable. So I guess the point that I'm making here is that we're not just talking about one case. We're not talking about 2, 3, 10, 50 cases. We are talking about an entirety of engagement with a government that has a horrific record of abuses of human rights. So I am thankful for the Arab Center for organizing today's event, and thank you again for Aida for giving us an update about Dr. al-Khudari's case. And I am hoping that we will push for an immediate release for Dr. al-Khudari and for his son, for the others who are arbitrarily detained in Saudi Arabia, but also think about the larger picture here, which is calling for rethinking the entirety of the relationship with the government of Saudi Arabia, rethinking it to stop funding and supporting an extremely abusive government that continues to commit these abuses every day with the blessings from the US and the EU.
Thank you, Raed, for describing for us the wider context of repression in Saudi Arabia and making the case for why we should have a much broader focus on Saudi Arabia rather than just simply individual cases, though the individual cases do speak to those broader issues. Of course, your presentation raises a number of questions about the current US government. As we know, Biden came in with a pledge to uphold human rights, be tough on Saudi Arabia. I wonder if you can give a response to that later on, whether you're happy with the US government now, you think Biden has upheld his pledge, but also on a wider issue, the case of Dr. Hani is really, many would feel a tug on Palestinians. 60 Palestinians were arrested. What does that say about the Saudi position on Palestine now? Have they turned their back on Palestine and the Palestinian cause? So maybe we can have a response on that afterwards. But if I may, is Sue okay to speak? Are you with us, Sue?
I don't yet have a strong connection, so if I could join you after the next speaker, I think that was probably going to work better. That's okay.
Okay. I mean, we were waiting for Nick to join us. Nick Rahel, former congressman. He was going to speak to us on Saudi-US relationships and on President Biden, his commitments on human rights. But Nick isn't here yet. So I think what I would do, I mean, I'd like to, until Sue finds good, strong connection, go back to Heidi and ask, what are you expecting with regards to the Committee on Arbitrary Detention? When will a report come out? Are you expecting a positive report? And also with regards to the 60, has there been a similar kind of complaint raised with the United Nations regarding the 60 other Palestinians who have been arrested in Saudi Arabia? And is there a general concern within the UN and various UN committees on the direction of Saudi Arabia since Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, when we have seen mass crackdown on human rights groups, women's activists, and whatnot, and changes in laws really as well, changes in laws which are criminalizing minor dissent on Twitter, on Facebook, and things like that. So just pick up on whatever item of whatever issue I've just touched on, Heidi, but generally on the committee itself and the 60 Palestinians, are there efforts to raise their concerns within the UN committees?
Thanks for all of those questions. I'll start with your question about the timing for the al-Khudari's case. As I mentioned, their case was considered in September by the working group, and it does take some time for them to write up the what comes, it looks quite like a legal judgment. It's their determination on the status of their detention, whether it's arbitrary under the international guidelines, the scenarios that I reviewed. So that takes some time to put together, and then the relevant state, so in this case, Saudi Arabia, is informed of the decision, and then the party bringing the complaint will be informed afterwards. So there isn't a set timeline. The working group doesn't have any timelines that they have to meet. I've been informed that the working group has considered it, and they'll let me know when they let me know, basically. So we certainly do hope that that will be as soon as possible, and at the same time keeping the working group updated on the deterioration of Dr. Mohammed al-Khudari's health, and letting them know about the urgency of knowing that decision as soon as possible. Now, as far as the result of that determination, I do believe that we have a very strong case. Of course, I can't guarantee what the result will be from the working group, but from everything that I've outlined, particularly the fair trial abuses and the irregularities to due process norms, it's very strongly against the procedures that Saudi Arabia followed, or didn't follow actually, during their entire trial. So I'm very hopeful for a good determination. I do believe that it's a very strong case, but I'll leave it at that because I don't want to mislead that that would be guaranteed. You never know what happens in any court or any judicial body. As far as the 60 plus other Palestinians who were arrested and detained at the same time and who have gone through very similar experiences, there have been some other cases that have been submitted to the UN working group. I've submitted a case on behalf of another individual, and there have been a few other lawyers that have submitted a communication to the working group and asking that their detention is reviewed for the arbitrary nature in the same manner. And I do believe that their case is maybe a step behind the al-Khudari's, because it has been emphasized quite strongly to the working group that Dr. Mohammed's health is in jeopardy, particularly the fact that he has, considering how much his health has deteriorated, particularly over the last year, that options such as house arrest or just providing him with the specialist care that he's needed, the treatment for his cancer and for other ailments that he's been suffering in detention, hasn't been considered by the Saudi authorities, or options where he could readily have that medical treatment like house arrest. So emphasizing that to the working group and hoping that they provide a decision as soon as possible. Now, what's important about this decision is, as I said before, it will allow us to hopefully put some pressure and really use this as a building block to apply pressure and to continue to raise the al-Khudari's case at the international level, and to be able to say, look, the UN working group has found that their detention is unlawful because it's arbitrary, because there was human rights violations to their fair trial rights, to the right to health, to the right against torture, and to say the UN has found this, so can you please put that pressure on the international level and raise this and demand that the Saudi authorities change their behavior, not only in regards to the al-Khudari's, but to many others as well. I'll leave it. I'm going to stop there. And
that's fine. I'm wondering whether, Sud, do you think you have a strong connection now? Are you able to speak? No, it doesn't seem like it. I mean, does anyone?
I'm nearly able to speak. Just give me 2 more minutes, but perhaps our other colleague could come back on those other issues that you raised, and then I could come in after that.
That's fine. We can wait 2 minutes. I think Raid, I think, has left the room as well. I did want to speak with Raid about the broader political situation in Saudi Arabia and what Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's crackdown signals for the direction in which Saudi Arabia is going, and what that means for, say, the Palestinian issues, because we are talking about the Palestinian issues. 60 Palestinians that were arrested just earlier this summer. So what does that indicate in terms of their stance on the Palestine? As we know, for many decades, Saudi Arabia was one of the countries that backed the so-called Arab peace process. And it's been backing that for the last 2 decades, which the Arab peace process, or which basically says it will recognize Israel within the 1967 borders, and if it enters occupation of West Bank and Gaza. But over the years, as we've seen, a number of Arab countries have normalized relations, and Saudi have so far, they've stuck to their guns, but it seems like they may also be shifting their position and go by the way of the UAE and a number of other countries, and turn their backs, as some say, on the Palestinian issue. So does the arrest of 60 Palestinians signal that? So we'll have to wait and see, but that raises a number of questions. But of course, the issue about human rights has been a priority for Joe Biden. I wonder if there has been any change within Saudi Arabia in its behavior, and have anyone noticed any change in behavior within the UN committees since the arrival of Biden and his pledge to uphold human rights and to punish and to be strong and tough on Saudi Arabia over its war in Yemen. And also following the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. We know the United States has released secret CIA documents over the murder and the killing, which implicates Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And the US, to its credit, has passed a law called the Khashoggi Ban, I think, which will impose sanctions on journalists, sanctions on countries who restrict the work and freedoms of journalists in their country. So that's a good and positive step they've taken. But overall, I wonder, though, if it's changed the behavior of Saudi Arabia, of course, a number of other countries in the region. But these are all questions which, if anyone wants to come in and give their thoughts on, feel free to do so. But maybe I think Sue opened her camera just a few seconds ago, so I'm wondering whether she's okay to chip in.
To sort out the tech, apologies.
That's fine.
So I wanted to start by thanking AOHR for asking me to speak at this event. It's kind of shocking that nowhere in the international media has this been mentioned, the fact that 68 political prisoners, or is it 69, one of whom is elderly and has cancer, have been detained without trial in Saudi Arabia. And I think that AOHR is fulfilling an important function in holding this meeting to try to raise awareness about the issue. And we've heard from Heidi about how she's trying to raise the issue in the international arena. I wanted to talk a bit about how we might raise the issue in the UK. And I'll be drawing on some of the points that Heidi has made. But maybe I could introduce myself for anyone who doesn't already know me. I'm a litigator at a public interest law firm called Dighton Pearce Glynn, where I've been involved in legal interventions challenging the export of arms to Saudi Arabia, who of course the UK is still trading with. And I'm also involved in working at King's College London in the legal clinic, where we are currently working in relation to the US. There's been a rather shocking case recently relating to a Guantanamo detainee called al-Nasri, where the US Attorney General is arguing that evidence obtained under torture should be admissible in interlocutory proceedings. So we often think of rogue states like Saudi Arabia being the only ones responsible for engaging in torture or being complicit in torture. We think of the United States as the place where due process happens. So I think it's important to remember the US's own failings and a worrying international trend, which is reflected by that case. And also wanted to remind people about the UK that anti-terrorism legislation has been repeatedly used by the UK, and it's even used by protesters who were protesting against deportation flights at Stansted Airport, who a large number of whom were charged and jailed in the past 2 years. I think it's useful to put that into context, but what can we do about it? Because it's easy to assume that the remedy for this kind of situation where a state like Saudi Arabia is just not interested in the rule of law or accountability or due process, can only be a diplomatic or political remedy, and that there's not much point in pursuing legal remedies like the remedy that Heidi's pursuing in the UN, for example. I think it is worth pursuing strategic legal remedies in the UK in relation to human rights abuses in the Gulf. I think we need to be realistic about it, but obviously we're not going to see Mohammed bin Salman in a UK court, but we can use those legal interventions to attract some press interest, which it seems is lacking at the moment. And we can also use it to put some international pressure on in relation to Saudi Arabia and put them in the international arena and hope that over time the situation there will change. And to give some kind of evidence that that can work, I'd like to refer back to the case of Lujain al-Hatul, the woman Saudi activist who was driving when driving as a woman was unlawful. And I think just 2 years ago, I was speaking on an AOHR platform about her situation, and she was still in jail. Of course, she's still in Saudi Arabia. She's still facing a travel ban, but she was released from jail to be under a house arrest. And I think perhaps that shows that some of the legal interventions and use of international law and international human rights law that were pursued in her case somehow were listened to by the Saudi royal family and those with the power to make decisions in Saudi Arabia. So obviously, Saudi Arabia is one of the few countries which refused to sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when the UN was founded, refused to sign the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and the treatment that Dr. Mohammed al-Khudari and his son and the other 67 or so Palestinians have received certainly doesn't comply with those basic rights. There's a lawyer's argument that in any case that declaration is part of customary international law, and so it binds all states, including Saudi Arabia. And there are various other UN mechanisms that could be pursued aside from the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. There's the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. We know from Heidi that to put someone in solitary confinement for a prolonged period can amount to torture and inhuman and degrading treatment. And in fact, the UN standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, which are known as the Nelson Mandela rules for obvious reasons, which Heidi referred to, and recent case law on the rule in relation to the rules interpreting the rules has found that solitary confinement, prolonged solitary confinement can amount to torture. And of course, as Heidi mentioned, those Mandela rules provide for physical and mental health care, access to healthcare for prisoners, and the states particularly responsible for prisoners who it deprives of liberty and have to provide healthcare, as she said, at the same standard as in the community. Although those rules aren't binding, again, it's arguable that they are reaching what's called jus cogens, which is to say that they are binding under international law on states. But I wanted to talk about something which could be done in the UK. I wanted to talk about the Magnitsky Rules. They first arose in the US. In 2012, the US Congress passed the Rule of Law Accountability Act after a Russian tax lawyer who'd committed fraud was jailed basically without trial, abused in prison and died in prison in 2009. And so following
lobbying after that death, this law was introduced. Global Human Rights Magnitsky Accountability Act was introduced in the US in 2016, which allows the US to impose sanctions on foreign nationals who are responsible for gross human rights violations. That can be government officials, it can be individuals. And our very own new Lord Chancellor, Dominic Raab, introduced similar provisions in the UK. He was very clear that where there were reasonable grounds to suspect serious human rights violations or abuses, the UK government, the Foreign Office, have got the power to impose sanctions. And it did impose sanctions under the regulations on 20 Saudi nationals who it's alleged were involved in the death of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who we've heard about earlier tonight. Sanctions have been imposed on Russian nationals, and of course this isn't a silver bullet. It's not going to bring those people to justice, but given Saudi financial interests in the UK and an enjoyment of travel to the UK, the sanctions can have an impact. So one approach might be to consider writing to the UK government to propose that those individuals, if we can identify them, who are responsible in Saudi Arabia for the jailing of the 69 Palestinians, of Dr. Mohammed al-Khudari, and their mistreatment in prison, should be subject to sanctions. I also think it's worth thinking about other ways of approaching the interests that are based in the UK, who have an interest in Saudi prisons. In the past, we have tackled training provided to and provision of services in relation to Saudi prisons. There are soft law remedies like the OECD rules, which apply to institutions and companies who are registered in the UK, who are based in the UK and providing services in Saudi Arabia. So I think this calls for research about those who are involved and who might be providing services to the Saudi prisons, who might be involved in decision making in relation to the unlawful detention, and then of course to try to raise this in the press, to lobby MPs and MEPs in the hope that indirectly through strategic legal action we can have some influence in relation to the actions of the Saudi officials, and hopefully that, like Lou Jane, we will soon see Dr. Mohammed al-Khudari outside jail at the very least and house arrest, and hopefully to be free at last. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, for giving us this perspective on the British angle and how that links in with the case of Dr. Hani. I was wondering though, when you were speaking, what you make, because you mentioned that Dominic Raab, British Foreign Secretary, he did impose sanctions on something like 20 Saudi officials, and there is appetite, however reluctant, on being tough on human rights abuses, as we saw in the US as well. But when it comes to big issues, I wonder, big personalities like Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, will the UK actually budge its position on being very pro-Saudi, doing weapons deals and things like this? We saw in the recent case, we saw, for example, the purchase of Newcastle United Football Club. The fund that purchased Newcastle United Football Club is owned by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is implicated by the CIA as being the person who authorized the killing of Khashoggi. So despite the fact that the Premier League, the British Premier League, has said that there's no connection between the investment fund which has purchased Newcastle United and the Saudi Kingdom, do you think this is a way of just basically trying to trick and maneuver its way around rules and regulation? And it's not really a serious indication that Britain as a country, because this issue, remember, was spoken about in the Parliament. MPs raised the issue of purchase of Newcastle United. They complained and they protested. Despite that, this has gone through. So I wondered, even though there are some reluctant, concessions made by the British government in going after 20 Saudi officials, but when it comes to this serious matter of weapons deal, when it comes to the serious matter of economic investment, when it comes to big fishes like Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, do you think they will actually budge and impose penalties and sanctions on figures like him?
Well, it's not for me to comment on the political issue. There are other people better placed to do that. But yeah, I'm sure no one's got any illusions about how easy it is to interfere with the UK's successful trading and diplomatic relationship with Saudi Arabia. However, I'm reminded of something that Mariam Al-Khawaja passed on from her father, who's been in a Bahrain jail for over a decade. And she spoke about how depressing it is to be a human rights defender, a human rights activist. And he replied to her that we don't win a human rights battle in a lifetime. It can take generations to make these kind of changes. So I think my experience of Gulf activists has been that through a lot of careful research and strategic thinking and really tireless work and use of social media and things like the Pandora Papers and other long-term journalistic interventions, we can find out more about what's happening, for example, with Newcastle Football Club, and we can try and expose it. I think Newcastle Football Club is a great opportunity to bring what's happening in Saudi Arabia into the minds of people on the streets of Newcastle and beyond, and the people that watch the Premier League all over the world. We could maybe see it as a kind of campaigning opportunity, lobbying opportunity, and maybe legal strategic opportunity if we can find those links. So I wouldn't like to underestimate the task that's ahead of us, but I'd say that working with those concerned about human rights and democracy in the Gulf has given me hope, because this is a very hard mountain to climb, but I think we have climbed it a little, and there are signs of hope, and it is worth continuing that struggle.
Thanks for that answer. I wonder if any of the guests want to ask a question to Heidi or Sue about what they've said so far. Does anyone want to raise an issue, make a comment? Feel free to do so. If not, I will ask one more question before we bring this session to a close. Does anyone want to ask a question? No, that's fine then. Okay, I mean, I just before we leave, question to both you, Sue, and Heidi. We just trying to broaden out this conversation with regards to Dr. Hani and the crackdown on 60 Palestinians. This is, of course, a much wider issue, and we saw Saudi Arabia try the attempts it goes to, the lengths it goes to silence its citizens, whether it be in the US, whether it be in Canada, in Europe. What other examples can we look at here in UK, for example, where Saudi Arabia has really extended and gone beyond your normal states to crack down on its, not just its citizens, people that are critical. So I mean, I'm reminded of a couple of years ago during the Cameron government when there were inquiries into various UK civil society groups. There were reports that Saudi Arabia and the UAE were lobbying British government to close down or crack down on British Muslim organizations that were supposedly linked to the Brotherhood. They were so they wanted they were lobbying for their crackdown, for their silencing. So I'm wondering how far this campaign to crack down on dissent actually goes. How far beyond Saudi citizens, Saudi journalists like Jamal Khashoggi? How wide is this effort to crack down on anti-Saudi dissent? Is that something you can comment on, Heidi or Sue?
I'm not sure that I could comment on particularly any other cases, but what I would say is that the cases that we have seen, particularly Jamal Khashoggi, where it's demonstrated that Saudi Arabia is going past its own borders, interfering in taking actions in other countries to silence anyone who speaks up and against their policies and exercises their rights to free expression. What I've seen from that I would like to take some encouragement from is that has seemed to have a thawing of the hesitancy to discuss transparently the actions of Saudi Arabia and their effect on fundamental human rights and engagement as well with the international community. I think the time period before Jamal Khashoggi was killed, there was very much a hesitancy to plainly speak about what was happening with Saudi Arabia and to criticize Saudi Arabia from a lot of members of the international community. And that does seem to be thawing, and there does seem to be a more frank discussion about Saudi Arabia's actions, that they're unacceptable, that they're counter to the rule of law, to international law, and that there just cannot continue to be just business as usual with Saudi Arabia when they're acting in this manner. Of course, I'd like to see much more of that. But you raised the example of Newcastle football team, and I did see Jamal Khashoggi's fiance, Hatija Cengiz, did raise a very strong counter narrative to that and objection, and was able to raise to Newcastle Football Club to recognize what Saudi Arabia's actions were, that they were an attempt to whitewash their actions against human rights and against international law, and that for some time period that did stall the transaction. I'm sorry to see that it did end up going through in the end, but I do think that sat in the mind of not only the football club but the fans as well, and it's starting that discussion. So I'd like to say that I'm heartened to see that there's starting to be a growing discussion, and I do hope that we see much more of it as well.
Okay, Heidi. Did you want to jump in, Sue? Or
well, I'll just say that part of my experience is working with human rights defenders from Bahrain, and people will know that Saudi Arabia has has had significant influence over Bahrain, starting with sending troops in during the Arab Spring protests. Bahraini human rights defenders have had their citizenship taken away whilst outside of the Gulf, whilst in the UK. And one of the tactics which is experienced by, I think, those who advocate for human rights across the Gulf, including in the UAE, is that newspapers receive letters from expensive lawyers, threatening libel if they publish information or criticisms of human rights in relation to human rights violations in the Gulf. And I feel that that can have an influence on the extent to which the mainstream media in the UK, I don't know the situation in the US, but certainly in the UK, the extent to which they'll be willing to publish stories about what's happening in the Gulf, like this. I don't know about this story, but stories in general. So I think it's important that we try to monitor that and challenge that wherever possible, because we do apparently have a free press in the UK, and it's not acceptable that the law can be used to intimidate newspapers and discourage them from publishing human rights violations that are happening in Saudi Arabia and beyond. Thanks.
Thanks for that. And law should not also allow, I think, foreign states to easily purchase your national newspapers as well. That's something which is happening in the UK as well. In any case, I think we've come to the end of our time, and it's been really enjoyable discussion. I want to thank all my guests, in particular Heidi, Sue, and Raid for your contributions. And I want to, of course, thank AOHR for putting this together. And see you all again soon, and take care. Bye-bye.